This conference will now be recorded.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's ITE Fireside Chat webinar hosted by ITE ANZ Australian and New Zealand section of the Institute of Transportation Engineers. We envision that our Fireside Chats will have a series of quite in-depth and honest discussions around topics in the transport profession. Today will be our second fireside chat in this series, where we'll be discussing the topic of inclusive and equitable transport. And I'm delighted that you can join us today to hear from three amazing speakers lined up. My name is Cassie Min. I'm a transport planner at Jacobs, and I also serve on the executive board of ITE ANZ as co-vice president and also on the younger member subcommittee Young ITE. I'm excited to be moderating this session today. So before we begin, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country on behalf of ITE ANZ and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the lands of Australia and New Zealand on which this webinar is being held on. ITE acknowledges the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. ITE acknowledges any Australian Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are at this event with us today. ITE also acknowledges and respects the Treaty of Waitangi and Māori as the original people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. We acknowledge people of Māori descent who are with us at today's event. As mentioned earlier, the ITE ANZ is a section of the Institute of Transportation Engineers and is based in Australia and New Zealand. As a brief overview, the ITE ANZ is an international network of passionate transport professionals who work collectively to improve mobility and safety for all transport system users to help build smart and livable communities. Hosting webinars such as this one is one of our activities to stimulate learning, lively discussion and debate, and to be a leading voice in the public square on issues, trends, and technical topics. We have over 15,000 members in 90 countries and always welcome new members. For students, membership is free for their first year. You can also keep updated on our events and news such as this one by following us on LinkedIn or Facebook. The ITE ANZ would also like to acknowledge our generous sponsors who, by their financial support, not only support the operations of ITE ANZ, but also share in our ethos to improve transport and create a better world. We are proud to have Oz Traffic as our platinum sponsor. Sponsoring our student award, we are proud to have Traffic Works. Sponsoring our President's Dinner and Postgraduate Award, we're proud to have Sidra Solutions. Sponsoring the annual breakfast is the RACV Club. And we'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, SMEC, Arab and O'Brien Traffic. The ITE ANZ is always open to partnering with you and your respective companies. So if you see a fit with us, then we would like to hear from you. Every year, the ITE ANZ recognises excellence and sponsors an award program to honour outstanding achievement in transport engineering within Australia and New Zealand. We have 6 award categories: contribution to the transport profession, outstanding service to the ITE, sustainable transport, emerging professional, the Sidra Solutions Postgraduate Award, and the Traffic Works Student Award. These awards are presented at the President's Dinner or the breakfast meeting. At the moment, nominations are currently open for 3 categories: contribution to the transport profession, emerging professional, and sustainable transport. And nominations close on Friday, the 25th of September. Further information can be found on our website. So for today's webinar, there are just a couple of tech housekeeping items that I wanted to mention. So firstly, during the presentations, please remain on mute. We welcome your questions, so enter them through the GoToMeeting chat. During the Q&A session, you'll also have the chance to turn on your mic and ask your questions directly to the speakers. On GoToMeeting, there's also the ability to manage your view of the cameras. So simply click on the camera drop-down menu, and you can put it as who's talking to see the presenter. So, as mentioned, the topic of today's fireside chat is inclusive and equitable transport. It aims to help transport professionals put inclusivity and equity at the forefront of the design and planning process. The topic of our webinar we'll be holding today follows the theme of an ITE podcast featuring Tamika Butler called Transportation and Equity, where they discuss the challenges faced as a transport user and how to educate others to consider the needs of all transport users. We have 3 wonderful speakers today. Firstly, we've got Bridget Burdett, Principal Researcher at MR Cagney, based in Hamilton, New Zealand. She works on transport research, policy and practice for a variety of government, university and private sector clients around New Zealand. She'll be discussing inclusion in transport, the influence of disability and income, and the implications for transport policy and practice. We also have David Simmonds, Director of Transport Accessibility and Inclusion at the Department of Transport Victoria. He is a passionate crusader for accessibility and inclusion across our public transport network. He'll be sharing his experience as a public transport user and how he's working to achieve universal access outcomes across the transport network. Finally, we have Janine Pawson, Senior Service Designer at Oricon Victoria. Janine is a strategic thinker, designer, and consultant in the domains of customer experience and service design. She will be discussing the user-centered design approach, which offers a process that all practitioners can adopt to become more conscious and inclusive transport practitioners. So the way we'll be structuring today's session is we'll have an introduction and presentation from each of the presenters, and then we'll be having a question and answer session following. So if you think of any questions during the presentations, feel free to add them to the chat box in GoToMeeting. And then during the Q&A session, you'll have the chance to turn on your mic and ask those questions directly to the speakers. Or alternatively, I can ask those questions. Great. Now I'll hand it over to you, Bridget.
Great, thanks, Cassandra. I'll just share my screen here. Cool, good morning everyone. Kia ora tātou, ko Ngāti Pakeha toku iwi, no kirikiri ahau, ko Burdett toku whānau, ko Doran toku whānau, ko Bridget Burdett toku ingoa. This week in New Zealand is Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori, which is Māori Language Week, and we have that every year. It's been running for 45 years, so thought I'd just share that with you and acknowledge the Māori people in New Zealand as well. So today I'm going to talk about, as Cassandra said, the role, influence of disability and income for inclusion in transport. To do that, I'm going to talk through these 4 areas. Firstly, what is inclusive access? Some statistics about disability, then some stats about income, how those things both relate to transport, and then some implications for transport policy and practice as it is delivered in the 21st century in Australia and New Zealand, because we can have all of the conversation we like about what disability is, how income affects equity, but if we can't then translate that into meaningful actions, then we're going to be relying on advocates for, you know, the rest of our careers, and I don't think that's good enough. So firstly, what is inclusive access? Well, I was taught at engineering school that accessibility is the ability to participate. And we talked about that to contrast accessibility from mobility, which is the ability to move around. So it really should be the goal of transport, not just to move people around, but to help them participate. And if we add in that word inclusive, then inclusive access means the ability of everyone to participate. I've got a picture on this slide of a really vibrant and brightly dressed crowd at a Sevens rugby tournament in Wellington. And we would like to know that any kind of activity that enriches people's lives is available for everyone to participate. So clearly transport has a big role to play in enabling that. So the next question then is, well, what affects participation for everyone? And one of the aspects, one of two that I'll talk about, is people's mental state, how they're actually feeling in the moment. So we all know ourselves, if we feel sick or tired or anxious or just a bit down, then we're less likely to have the motivation to go out and do something and more likely to find an excuse not to. And those momentary capacities affect all of us. The other factor is our physical and sensory capacity to participate. I have three pictures here. The first one describes permanent disability. So somebody who has a disability, for example, that requires them to use a wheelchair, and it's not going to change day to day. It is what it is. The second is a temporary disability, or a state where someone perhaps is recovering from surgery. There's a picture here of a man using a mobility scooter. That state affects them in the moment, but it's not affecting them for their whole life necessarily. Then we have a situational impairment, which means a situation has made somebody less able to do something than they would have otherwise. The example in the picture is somebody walking, a mother presumably pushing a child in a buggy along a roadside because the footpath has been blocked off. And those different types of capacity impairments, permanent, temporary, and situational, I've adapted those for transport from the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit. And if any of you are interested in more detail about that, it's a very handy way to communicate differences in capacity. So this slide shows the combination of different mental states and people's capacities making up who they are as a human in a certain moment. And when we put those through the lens of somebody's income, then all of those things together affect whether they will participate or not. And we'll come back to that in a moment. I'm going to talk now about some disability statistics. So we know in Australia and New Zealand, disability, people around 18 to 25% of both populations identify with a long-term disability that affects their life. In Australia, for example, this slide shows that the average male born in 2015 can expect to live 17 years of their life with a disability. I quite like the way that that is framed, because it reminds us all that we are human and we are fragile, and disability is not an all or nothing game. It, in the end, comes to a lot of us. So that comes from the Australian government statistics on people with disability. In New Zealand, we have similar proportions of disability and probably similar expectations over our lives, but it varies a lot by ethnicity. And in New Zealand, we know, for example, that Māori New Zealanders have a much lower life expectancy than Pākehā or non-Māori New Zealanders, some 7 years on average, and rates of disability are higher in every age group. This slide is quite complicated, but it shows, for example, that Māori New Zealanders of working age between 40 and 64 years, 43% identify with a disability of some kind. That's a really high number, and I like to highlight that because it reminds us that disability affects all age groups, and we need to think about it for every kind of transport plan that we do. It is not exclusive to older people by any means. Now I'm going to talk about some income statistics and how that affects equity and inclusion in transport. So New Zealand data about income tells us we can look up the median or mean income for people of different professions and different levels of qualification. And we know, for example, from that the mean weekly earnings of a male with a bachelor's degree in New Zealand is around $1,600. And I've got a picture there of what Google Images told me a transport planner looks like. So in New Zealand, that would be typically a male with a bachelor's degree, and the mean weekly income for them is $1,600. However, the mean weekly earnings for a female who has no qualifications is $774, which is less than half of the male who is planning the transport system. And bear in mind that this is the mean, so there is huge variation around those numbers. And in fact, the people who have the most influence in planning transport and writing policy probably sit at the upper end of the range for the male with the bachelor's degree. So they'll be earning a lot more than that. They'll have an even more privileged perspective on who and what they are designing for, whereas there are a whole lot of people in our cities, towns and rural areas who earn a lot less than $700 a week. So it's important then to be aware of our biases in terms of who's making the decisions and whose communities those decisions are affecting. But we can find data that tells us more about the variation in those kinds of factors, and therefore how we can plan to help them. Here is a map. It shows our census area units in Auckland. So they are areas home to around 5,000 people, and how those areas vary in terms of income quartiles. So there are purple areas on the map which show a very low prevalence of low income people. So they are the wealthiest areas. And then there are yellow areas on the map which show the highest prevalence of low income people. So they are the poorer areas. This map happens to also have train lines and train stations on it, which in Auckland, where the map is, are probably the most direct and highest frequency public transport routes, apart from our busway on the North Shore. But you can quickly start to see, well, where are the communities who might find it most difficult to get around, and how well are we serving them? And you can dig then into more detail about other public transport options and information about, for example, whether those people will have access to a motor vehicle or not, and even from our census where they tend to be going to. Because a lot of people, the further away they are from the central city, they may be less likely to have a workplace there, particularly low-income people, less likely to be professionals. So they might work in factory jobs or shift work or retail that is not as well served by direct public transport as the other routes are. We can also look at indices of social deprivation. So they are broadly a measure of people's capacity to have a good life, and income is just one factor that goes into those indices. They exist in New Zealand and Australia, and those data are publicly available. So we can find them, we can map them, and we can use them, I think, anytime we're looking at a transport network map or a model, then we should also be looking at these other community indicators of equity and where the needs really are. Because at the end of the day, we're wanting people to participate. We want the transport network to facilitate that, but we don't want an efficient transport network as its own end. We need to be thinking about why we have that network and how it's helping people to live their lives. So this map shows Northland, the region in New Zealand at the north of the North Island. And we have blue areas where they are the least deprived areas. So they have the highest incomes, the highest rates of access to internet and motor vehicles, and the highest levels of education, for example. Whereas the red areas, which occupy great swathes of this northern part of the North Island, are the most deprived. So those people are least likely to travel as far as the others. They need to be able to access activities locally or access affordable transport choices to get them there. So it just frames the conversation about transport and what we're delivering in a different kind of way. But I think because these data are so accessible, it makes it really easy for us in the transport industry if we know to use that to tell that story alongside whatever other transport story we're telling at the time. Now, when we combine income and disability, this slide has a graph of persons aged 15 to 64 years and their income, whether or not they have a disability. So what it shows is that, no surprise to anybody, people who report a disability are much more likely to be in the lowest income band than people without a disability. And we see that all around the world, in fact, but this is Australian specific data. And whenever we're trying to convince people to invest in something, then local data is obviously the most useful. Similarly, in New Zealand, this slide says that disabled people work fewer hours for lower wages, and they're less likely to have all levels of qualification. So having a low income is not directly correlated with disability, of course. There are a lot of people who have a low income who are not disabled, in fact, most. However, if you have a disability and a low income, there is this double whammy in transport where it will be very difficult to overcome challenges in the transport system to go out and live a good life. So the income gap, gender pay gap between males and females also exists within the disabled population. And in New Zealand, non-disabled males have an employment rate of 75%, which includes retired aged people, versus disabled females, only 21% are categorised as employed. So these are some of the factors that go into what people's incomes are. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes now talking about the implications of these data for transport policy and practice. And the first implication is that we should use these data in transport policy and practice, because if we don't measure equity in transport, we don't have any uniformly agreed ways to do that. And if our built environments are dominated by privileged people making decisions about them, then inequity will grow, because those people making the decisions can't use data that is not available to them. The reason data is important is because transport planning, especially engineering and decisions, are based on good evidence and data and feedback loops. An example on this page is road safety. We have crash data to guide every level of decision making in road safety, and we know whether we're doing any good by whether crashes are coming down. For inclusive access, we don't have any equivalent outcome measure. We don't know what we're trying to improve or reduce. So we have ad hoc investment that we cannot tell whether it's answering a question or not, because we haven't articulated that question. So how can we do that? Well, we need to talk with people about what trips they don't make, find out more about the travel costs that are imposed on people, and measure diversity of participation. That means who is participating and who isn't. When I say talk with people about trips not made, there's an example here where I interviewed someone and they said, my brother's cared for in a home, and unless it's scheduled in advance, he has no access to a mobility vehicle. It affects his social interaction and excludes him. When we're talking with people about the costs that transport imposes, this is a massive problem in both Australia and New Zealand. We've found from interviews that people struggle to make payments for a loan for a car that they need because public transport doesn't meet their everyday transport needs. There's a lot of interest on those loans and creates a vicious cycle of debt that people have. When we talk about diversity of participation, we can count the number of people using wheelchairs, guide dogs, white canes, and mobility scooters, for example, and we can measure differences between areas that have different levels of accessibility. We can also map things as simple as age structure, so how many older people live in different communities, because if we're targeting interventions to a particular group, if we want to improve participation for a particular group, then we can find out before we start the investment where those people live. Then we can go back and use the other tools that I've mentioned, talk with people, count people, to see whether that investment has paid off. And I think that overall we can do a much better, as I've said, tell a much better story about equity and inclusion, use maps and graphs and data that transport planners can relate to so that we can all get better outcomes. And that is all from me. And now I'm going to hand over, I believe, to David Simmonds, who's going to carry on from here.
Thank you, Bridget, and good morning, everyone. And thank you, Cassie, for the introduction earlier. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wathaurong people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm coming to you from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to thank ITE for inviting me along today to share with you my, I guess, unique perspective on how I use public transport, and also what some of the work I'm involved in ensuring that we can provide a more accessible and inclusive public transport in Victoria. So I thought I'd start by giving you a bit of an insight into how vision loss has affected my use of the public transport system. So I have a degenerative eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa. I was diagnosed at the age of 15, and even though at 15 my sight was relatively good, it deteriorated over a prolonged period of time until sort of mid to late 20s, where I lost all functional sight. It's funny listening to some of the stats that Bridget was just going through. I thought to myself, I've never really considered myself as being someone who has a disability, even though I'm totally blind now. I kind of figured we've all got our own unique challenges in life. Vision loss for me is my challenge, and you know, that's something I need to overcome, and obviously it presents some obstacles in life, but just a challenge, like we all have to face different challenges in life. Obviously it's affected and impacted how I use public transport. Because it was a degenerative condition, I've experienced public transport as someone who is fully sighted, right through the stages of vision loss. So I've used mobility devices such as an ID cane, which is a shorter white cane to indicate that you're someone who has poor sight, through to a longer cane, which is the one that you'd see with the golf ball on the end, that you actually feel around with, and basically an obstacle detector. So you want the long cane to find any obstacle in your path, because if the cane doesn't find it, your head certainly is, and that hurts, let me tell you. So using long canes right through to guide dog mobility, and I'm now on my third guide dog, and I'm not sure, I provided a photo for the promotional material for this event, and it was a photo taken about probably only 3 or 4 weeks ago now. It was a photo taken of my guide dog and I doing our morning walk. We're in a bit of a ritual at the moment of going for our walk in the morning, given we're in semi-lockdown in Victoria. I'm in regional Victoria, so it's not quite as bad as in Melbourne, but we're allowed out for a walk, and it actually snowed on this particular morning, which so there's an interesting photo of my dog and I with snow on us on our morning walk. But so I guess a typical day for us pre-COVID or COVID normal would look something like me leaving the house, giving my guide dog a command to find a local bus stop. And so just by giving her that command, she'll safely guide me to my local bus stop. The bus arrives and I'll give her the command to find the door of the bus. She'll find the door of the bus, we get on the bus, I ask her to find a seat. And importantly, she finds me an empty seat, because I don't like to sit on anyone's lap. So she finds me an empty seat, and the bus takes me to my local station where we alight the bus. The guide dog will guide me all the way to the platform that we are required to find. Once again, we wait for the train to arrive, and when the train arrives, I give her the command to find the door. And once again, she finds me an empty seat, so I don't have to sit on anyone's lap. We get down into Melbourne CBD to the station we alight from, and from that location, it's a very, very busy station, and she navigates us out of that very busy precinct and all the way we walk all the way to my office within the centre of Melbourne, all the while avoiding all the obstacles in my way that you know, I'm quite oblivious to, because the guide dog guides me safely around all those obstacles. And then of course we do the reverse in the evening. So it's quite amazing how I guess a mobility device such as a guide dog can really provide that really high level of independence. But it does emphasize to me, having been through those different stages of vision loss, how reliant you are on communications for me. So both audible and accessible information. Information is key, and particularly during times of disruptions where, you know, it's all hunky-dory when everything's running smoothly. But when there's a disruption and all of a sudden, for example, you've got to get off at a station you've never got off at before, that really can throw a spanner in the works if the appropriate information isn't provided. Technology's certainly come a long way, and I'm going to show my age a bit here, but when I started losing my sight, we certainly didn't have smartphones, but smartphones now, I certainly wouldn't leave the house without it. you can probably all see my smartphone now. The screen is black, and it's always black because I can't see the screen, so I never have the screen on, which means my the batteries in my phone last a really long time, which is great. But some of the apps on the smartphones these days are absolutely amazing and absolutely critical for me to navigate my environment. So I use a smartphone essentially like a secondary mobility device. So my guide dog is my primary mobility aid. This is my secondary mobility aid. So it can provide everything from audible information on navigation. So using some mainstream apps and some specialized apps, I can get the phone to just give me audible instructions on how to reach a particular destination. As smart as the guide dogs are, I can't just say to my guide dog, find 555 Burke Street in Melbourne. She'll probably look at me a bit strangely. So that's where I can give the dog generic commands such as straight on, left, right, that sort of thing. And I can have a little earpiece. I've got a little Bluetooth earpiece I can have in my ear. I can have, when I start my trip, I can put in the destination information. And then along the way, I get little cues to say, you know, in 100 meters, turn right, turn left, whatever, which I can relay onto the dog. By way of, you know, find left, find right, that sort of information. If I ever get disorientated, I can just hit the home button and say, where am I? And straight away I get a street address of where I am, which is absolutely key. So technology, it's not the answer for everything, but it certainly fills a big gap in providing information to people who don't necessarily have access to mainstream communication or messaging that's out there for the general public. I'd like to talk about, so I currently work for the Department of Transport. Prior to working for the Department of Transport, I spent some time working, a number of years working at Guide Dogs Victoria. My role with Guide Dogs Victoria was an advocacy role and business development role within the organisation. And what I found myself doing there was advocating for the clients of Guide Dogs Victoria. So when they encountered access issues in their environments, they would contact Guide Dogs Victoria and I would assist them in resolving that issue. That issue invariably involved transport, whether it be taxis or, you know, what are the mainstream transport providers, whether it be a train, tram, bus. And generally it was to do with the refusal of guide dogs. This actually led to me establishing a number of key relationships with different transport providers within Victoria. One of them was with what used to be known then as Taxi Services Commission. It's now Commercial Passenger Vehicles Victoria. And one of the interesting operations that we established together there was, they affectionately called it Operation Olga, and Olga happened to be the name of my guide dog at the time. A particularly naughty little guide dog, but nevertheless, she was involved in this compliance operation whereby I would work alongside two undercover compliance officers from Taxi Services Commission, and we would target different taxi ranks within Melbourne and various suburbs around Melbourne. And what we were looking for there was for drivers to allow me to enter the taxi. Quite often, guide dog handlers are refused access to taxis. Fortunately, it's happening less, but it is still happening. And so what we would do is I'd approach the taxi rank, open the door, ask them if they could take me somewhere in my less confident voice. If I'm approaching it privately, I'm a very confident transport user, and I just jump in, and they actually don't get a chance to refuse me access. But in this instance, I took a more feeble approach, opened the door. Can you please take me to the ITE Hospital? And what we were looking for there is for drivers to allow me access to the taxi and say, yeah, you know, jump in, which of course they're obliged to do. Occasionally we would strike a driver that did refuse access to the taxi, in which case I gave a discreet signal to the undercover compliance officers, who would then approach, jump in and give the driver a little bit of education and sometimes a ticket. So that was a really interesting operation we were involved in there, and obviously the purpose there was to move through a compliance exercise with drivers to really highlight to them the importance of not refusing access to people who are blind and who use guide dogs to taxis. Another really important key initiative that Guide Dogs Victoria undertook was an experiential exhibition called Dialogue in the Dark. They asked me to get involved in that experience by way of providing corporate workshops out of that facility. But I think what I want to highlight here is that there was part of the exhibition was where you move through a number of environments in complete darkness. And when I say complete darkness, we had these environments professionally darkened. So there was not just, if you as fully sighted people, if you put your hand right in front of your face, you couldn't see it. So we took people through this exhibition in groups of 7. They were guided by someone who themselves were either blind or had low vision. We gave participants a long cane, so that's the way they would move through these darkened environments. And there were 3 key environments we moved them through. The first being an outdoor type environment where there were, so we were essentially encouraging people to tap into their other senses to explore those environments, given that they couldn't use their sight. So the first environment being a natural environment, plants, trees, grass on the ground, lily-dale topping pathway. There was a creek that you crossed over a bridge. You ended up being outside the MCG. You obviously couldn't see it, but you could hear the roar of a crowd. There was a statue out the front of Ron Barassi, a bust of Ron Barassi, as you'd expect to find out the front of the MCG. But of course, all participants could do was to feel the environment around them. The second environment we took them through was very much based on a cityscape. And so there was a small market that you'd move through, feeling fruit, vegetables and the like. There was a construction site and there was a busy roadway, and we led people onto what they didn't know was at the time, but when it started moving, they realised that we actually led them onto a tram. So they actually got to experience getting on a tram with, you know, effectively what was being totally blind, getting on a tram, the tram moving, getting off the tram and then crossing a busy roadway. At the end of the experience, there was an opportunity for them to have a discussion with the tour guide to really get a better idea of how they interact with their environment and how they interact with public transport in their daily travel. So really powerful experience and a really valuable experience that was provided to people working in the transport sector. That, I guess, took me on to, and through my time at Guide Dogs Victoria, I mentioned that I established the relationships with different people within the transport sector. An opportunity came up to join what was then Public Transport Victoria, now Department of Transport. And it really gave me and has given me the opportunity now to do what I was doing at Guide Dogs Victoria, sort of with the advocacy work. I'm doing a lot of the same work now, but I'm now doing that from within the department. So really exciting opportunity for me there. The purpose of the branch that I actually direct is essentially to ensure that Department of Transport provides a more accessible and inclusive public transport for everyone. And we do that by ensuring that accessibility and inclusion is a key consideration in everything we do. We do this in a number of ways, and we're involved in a number of really interesting and exciting initiatives. Currently, we're involved in the modernisation of DSAP, the Disability Standards for Accessible Public Transport. It's been jointly led by the Commonwealth and Queensland. I'm involved in the National Task Force, and a number of my staff are involved in working groups that are currently working on the reform of that important set of standards. Of course, my branch provides technical advice to different teams within Department of Transport and also to our operators. And we also provide secretariat support to the Public Transport Access Committee. So that's a committee, ministerial appointed committee that provides really important advice to the Minister on the accessibility of our transport network. And finally, I'd like to probably just leave you with just touching on briefly an education and experiential program that we run for people in the transport sector, primarily in the Department of Transport and our operators. and that is travelling in the shoes of others. And that's where we send people off. We host a half-day workshop for them. After a pre-briefing, they're broken up into groups of 3. We pair them up with an instructor, and they go out onto the network, the transport network, with a simulated disability, whether that be blindfold, simulation goggles, that might be in a wheelchair or in a mobility device. They're given a route map, and they need to board and alight buses, trains, and trams in a set route, come back. And for many of our transport operators and people working in the sector, it provides that real light bulb moment where beforehand they were aware of all the standards and obligations that the statutory obligations they needed to comply with. But this workshop, travelling in the shoes of others, really gives them that light bulb moment of, okay, now I really get why it's so important. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll now hand over to Janine. Over to you, Janine.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. I love hearing about all of these programs, especially also this traveling in the shoes of others. Thank you so much. Good morning and kia ora, everyone. My name is Janine Pawson, and I'll be chatting to you over the next 14 or 15 minutes or so about design research. So before I kick off and start sharing my screen, I wish to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of this land that I myself am sitting on. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. So without any further ado, I'm going to hopefully not be the one who faux pas with sharing my screen, but I just need to ask Christina to grant me access to share my screen, please. Or David. There we go. Thank you, Laura. Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to be talking to you about design research today. So really and truly, this is about conversations that can inform equitable transport outcomes. So I am a service designer at Oricon, and my role is basically sitting within the user-centered design team, which sits under design integration, which is led by Heath Gledhill. So the team offers a multidisciplinary approach to engineering through strategic thought leadership across multiple business streams, most commonly in infrastructure, built environment and planning sectors, and with our vision to support all solutions delivered by Oricon. So when you place people at the center of a conversation, you begin to truly consider what a project needs to deliver. So how a project integrates into its surrounding context, how it performs for those who will use it, and the legacy that it will leave. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. So I'm quoting Tamika Butler here, and they were really bang on. And this is also why perhaps user-centered design is so challenging in the engineering space. So really and truly, we are pushing different approaches away from siloed thinking and providing actionable inputs for transport planners as well as urban designers. Some of the things that I really resonated with in Tamika's podcast was that we have to think about how we engage with a community who are entirely different from yourselves. Touching on what Bridget was saying earlier around, perhaps white male privileged transport engineers designing solutions for less abled females who aren't employed, for example. So another quote that I really love is that we have to meet the unmet, unarticulated needs of customers. That is where the source of innovation lies. So if there's anything that we've got to make sure each day, each week, each year, is that we are in touch with those unarticulated and unmet needs. So this is what design research really and truly seeks to uncover and inform the design of experiences. So when we think about experiences, we're thinking about spaces. So the physical spaces that give people signals about how to behave and influence how they feel. We think about services, which is deep understanding of people that you serve, not only what they need and desire, but what limitations they face and what motivates them and what's really important to them. we think about systems. We want to set high-level strategies such as visions, priorities, policies, and key communication around these ideas. And products. So all people are deserving of well-designed products, but challenges arise when the design of them isn't informed by broad-ranging perspectives and needs. So in our role as user-centered designers, we try to look at all of these things, and this is also why we are placed within Oricon to serve a number of different industry verticals, such as environment, so built environment, transport planning, etc., etc. So when we look at hierarchy of needs, what we have found is that extending Maslow's hierarchy of needs and applying a theory of human motivation into design itself is really where we want to play. We seek to lift design outcomes for all people to the highest level. So the main little triangle that you can see there is a kind of updated hierarchy of needs, but it throws a design spin onto it. And this was probably published about 10 years ago now. So when at the bottom of this pyramid, if you will, you have your basic requirements, and that's around functionality. And then you go up to reliability, where you have consistent performance of say, a transport network, for example. Then you go up to usability. How intuitive is the design for those that are going to be using it? Then you start going up to proficiency, really providing experiences that are better than before. I would imagine that the DSAP modernization is really seeking to aim really high in terms of really delivering something that's better than before. And then at the very top, you have creativity, which is all about innovation. So these are some of the guiding frameworks that we start to look at when we are starting to design experiences. So, sign of the times, COVID, coronavirus. Social distancing has prevented a lot of companies from actually getting face-to-face customer feedback through conferences, in-person labs, and meetings. Traditional methods many companies relied on for insight gathering are well and truly challenged at the moment. Many of the companies are looking to remote user tests as a way to replace their custom insight. I'd also like to add to that for a design researcher, we place a lot of value in actually being out in the field and doing observational behavioral ethnographic research. And we want to, as I said, uncover those unmet, unvoiced, latent needs that people might have. Many companies are finding that customers are more stressed and emotional than usual and are accelerating their deployment of user tests to get fast feedback. So in light of the rapid changes that COVID-19 has brought about, companies are also seeking to better understand how their customers' needs are changing, but also how employees are empathizing with the times as well, and in turn how those employees themselves are experiencing these times. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of listening that can happen at the moment as well. And in terms of listening, the way that we have had digital technology enable us to stay connected during these times has really been a wonderful way to still be able to conduct design research during these times. So this is a quote from a recent piece of work that we did, where we actually interviewed some people with a range of, disabilities ranging from mobility, cognitive, vision, hearing, and so forth, about their experiences on some of the aspects of the Victorian Transport Network. And she said they were so excited to be able to contribute to the major infrastructure project. They just couldn't believe it. It was mind-blowing for them that they actually were able to have a voice. So if you are to think about the positives that have come out of COVID-19, is that we have found ways to speak to people that that isn't too taxing for them, because the the depth and breadth that we went to in this piece of research, we covered an insanely huge amount of ground in a very short space of time, all from the comfort of our interview participants' homes. So that was really wonderful, and I would love to see how design research evolves using this kind of technological approach to gain access to insight that we otherwise may have found either too costly because it would have taken too much time, and it would have been just not prioritized because of COVID-19 actually not being around. So design research isn't as easy as everyone thinks it is. There's a lot of logistics and coordination in the background, and there's also a lot of preparation that goes into the questions that we ask, the way that we ask them, the way that we record them, and the way that we dig deeper. We use what's the word? Long, deliberate pauses. We ask why. We ask them a lot of those touchy-feely questions. Well, how does that make you feel? What is the impact of that? I think that we certainly felt comfortable to be brave to go into what was unusual. And I haven't personally had the opportunity to speak to people this directly before, and I was nervous. I didn't want to do the wrong thing. I didn't want to say the wrong thing, but it was all about very real experiences, very relevant experiences. And again, just the insights and the stories that they were telling were just great. So being able to break down some assumed barriers, because it's really not that hard a conversation to have about people's lives at the end of the day. So we're talking about representation, and I've put a few random stats in here, and they cross things such as disability, but also the LGBTI groups, aging population, stay-at-home fathers, for example, our Indigenous communities, youth on the spectrum. My point here is that there is a significant part of the population who experience things very differently to the ways that we do as, I would say, privileged white people. And they have very unique experiences, very different approaches to life, and they have very, very interesting and refreshing perspectives as well. So while these are stats, it is important to note the size, the number of people that we're talking about here. These are all voices that have thoughts, feelings, and most importantly, want to have a say in the things that affect them. And that comes straight through to transport planning. So yes, we can talk about education, welfare support, policy, investment, everything. These people can offer you a diverse and refreshing perspective that can actually inform some of the ways that you might design a response to a problem. So this is all about taking a view onto your own, as we have heard from David as well as Bridget today. And this is also about human outcomes. So this is about going beyond requirements and compliance. We want to strive to deliver enjoyable experiences, not just experiences that meet the needs of people in terms of them being able to accomplish their goals. We want people to really feel good about what it is that they are experiencing. So understanding and meeting human needs are critical for improved livelihoods and better governance. Kind of goes hand in hand. I'm going to go into a little bit of psychology now. So human behaviors and desired experiences. To have an easy experience, it needs to not only be an easy physical environment, but also be easy for the brain of the customer to navigate. So essentially, we want to minimize fear responses and maximize reward responses. We need to move our users into a reward state and keep them out of the threat state. So this is something that we need to think about when we are designing transport networks, for example. And those moments, as David mentioned earlier before, about disruption, for example. What kind of responses will these ranges of people have when they go into disruption states? Are they going to go into a fear response? So classic fight or flight response. We do not want to have people going into that if we can avoid it. We also want to design for great user outcomes that are equitable. So spanning again across services, systems, spaces, and products, we want to move users into a reward state that enables a psychologically safe state. So fundamentally, we need to deliver an experience that appeals to the human drivers of motivation and behavior for safety, autonomy, fairness, esteem, trust, and of course yourself to address their own situation. So this is a cool little acronym that we often allude to, and it's quite funny when we have these conversations with transport planners. They think of safety in the traditional sense of safety, but we're talking about a psychological sense of safety here as well. So these are all very important and very relevant to all of those who are deserving of equitable transport outcomes. So this is one of my favorite design research photos. It's actually from a real life experiment that was done in Sweden, where they wanted to monitor what happens in the family home kitchen. And so a guy sat there and observed the family over the course of a week or two. And funnily enough, the subject and the interviewer became very, very fast friends. But it was just funny because the researcher was told he had to stay, separated from them, but he actually became involved in their everyday life. It's quite funny. In terms of some great research insights that can inform design and take design beyond compliance, some of the things that we've heard in our research are things like the sounds that those with limited vision rely upon of and around infrastructure, such as the different sounds of different railing types. They give the user a sense of where they are in the space. We've also found that with some of our interviewees that their immediate reaction about safety, they know their limitations and hazards exceptionally well. They are very straight to the point. They don't sugarcoat things and are so very down to earth. They have the same grievances as anyone else. One quote that we had was, "One thing I absolutely hate about these places is the smoking. Can't stand it. It should be banned." So, same things that aggrieve us are just as annoying for other people as well. We heard insights about how wonderful it was when other people hit the audio poles. They could hear them from quite some distance away. Other insights included how well they know that the gap between the transport and the stop had maximum thresholds for their mobility aids, or that tactiles can sometimes jolt them out of their wheelchairs. We also gain insights around safety and that people will avoid travel altogether at night because they don't feel safe. How much exclusion does that drive? This is it's just not fair. Basically, we can't have a transport network that operates like that, in my opinion. So the point here is that the insights that we can get through our design research that touch on all of the senses for these people just uncover so many more fascinating insights that we can then turn it into actionable things that can go into user requirements, user testing, so that we can actually open the dialogue and talk to these people about what the design is proposing and how they respond to it. It's really important. An example here that I have is a delightful social integration project that brought people of all ages and abilities together to enjoy local beaches in Japan. It's a small initiative that has achieved considerable success and acts as an inspiration and as a tribute to civic engagement. It's a very diverse mix of integrated recreational group activities that are offered, and some use some, innovative products and techniques. I think that was part of the way that it was co-designed by the interested parties. But, universal design is not strongly catered for in outdoor activities in Japan. And as a consequence, people with disabilities have less choice and less incentive when it comes to enjoying nature. So this project aimed to turn this specific beach into a universal amenity where disabled and older people and parents with small children can enjoy themselves on the beach and take part in seaside activities. So it's a really lovely example there of a great outcome and enjoyment for everyone. So in my research, I was looking at where equity may or may not be contributing. And I found in the Infrastructure Australia priority list that was just recently published, there are 5 priorities. Equity well and truly touches all of these. So when we're talking about lowering barriers to entry and fostering competition to make better use of resources and minimize costs for businesses and consumers, equity plays a huge role there. National connectivity, improving the ease of movement from one part of Australia to another for all people, goods and services. Remote infrastructure, delivery of quality services and infrastructure in remote areas of Australia to improve quality of life. Again, equity, equity, equity. Road safety. Safety has been brought about a lot today, and we want to reduce risk, injuries and deaths on Australia's road. Again, if we speak to these people, we will know the things that drive great cognitive load, anxiety and stress. Social infrastructure, facilities, spaces, services and networks that support the quality of life and well-being of our communities. Again, of all people, of all ages, ranges, types, whatever you might want to call it. The priority list has equity sprinkled all over it. So I would encourage you to take a look and see how your solutions cater to this priority list as well. And then lastly, I just thought I'd share some links that are quite fascinating. So the Victoria Transport Policy Institute has actually got a paper that was published this year that evaluates transport equity in Victoria specifically, so check that out. There is also an Aboriginal Professionals in Transport network in Victoria. So that the idea for an Aboriginal network was first raised by Nian Carter, a Jarrah woman from the Dja Dja Wurrung, Yorta and Wamba Wamba clan groups during her internship in the Gen 44 program at the Level Crossing Removal Project. So out of great infrastructure projects also come great groups and focuses that it's just great to hear about. There's also an Aboriginal Service Development Officer in New South Wales, and there is also the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Corporation Transport and Community Services Transport Dreaming National Conference coming up in 2021. So I would encourage you to get involved if you aren't already. And so my departing question to you is, what wicked and equitable problems are you looking to solve for your users, citizens or customers? Share your experiences and stories and reach out and have a chat if you want. Cool. I might hand back to Laura. Or
thanks, Janine. Kat will be moderating the questions. That was brilliant.
Yep. Can you hear me? All good?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Janine, Bridget and David, for your really diverse and insightful presentations on the topic of inclusive and equitable transport. So we're going to go into the Q&A session now. But before we start this session, I'd just also like to mention something that we didn't mention at the beginning, that we'll also be having an evaluation survey at the end of this webinar. So it would be really good if you can spend a few minutes to do the survey. It will really help us with future webinars and planning topics. We'll be putting a link at the end. So looking at the chat box, it does look like we've already got a few questions in there, so we will get started. But if you do have any questions from any of the speakers, as mentioned before, feel free to add the question into the chat, and then you'll have the opportunity to turn on your mic and ask these questions directly. Cool, so I might just get started from the top. So we've got a question from Knowles Tivendale. So Knowles, did you want to ask your question to David? If Knowles is there. Okay, no problem. I will ask the question. So, question for David. Can Operation Olga be restarted to address the lack of compliance with Uber and other transport network company operators? It seems galling that Uber has made little impact to meet the Commonwealth legislative requirements without any repercussions.
Yeah, it's a good question about, and I guess I can come at this from a couple of different angles. Noel, I certainly pre my DOT or PTV days, had, as I mentioned about compliance issues with the taxis. That certainly wasn't confined to taxi providers. It was also from rideshare providers that who also have that obligation of not just, they have obligations under DSAP. From my guide dog days, they were certainly, rideshare providers were also from time to time refusing access to people with guide dogs. That's just obviously only one aspect of accessibility. But there is a trial going on. I guess a key enabler of rideshare providers providing more or a greater level of accessibility will be when they can utilise the MPTP program. So that's a multi-purpose taxi program. For those who don't know, the MPT provides discounts to holders of the card. So typically it'll be someone who is unable to use public transport for some reason, or it provides them a discount off the taxi fare at the moment. There's certainly work going on to look at how that might be opened up more broadly so that rideshare operators can also utilise that. Now, when that is to occur, that will certainly provide an incentive to rideshare providers to then provide more vehicles and to provide more accessible trips. And also, I think will really open up the opportunity of them providing more wheelchair accessible vehicles as well. Right now, because they can't access the MPTP, there's not a great incentive, because a lot of people who would use wheelchair accessible taxis would have the benefit of a MPTP, which provides a discount, and the operator themselves, the driver or the operator of the vehicle, gets extra lifting fee and all sorts. So I think us continuing, the department continuing its exploration around the more broad delivery of the MPTP discount program to rideshare operators will certainly help in that regard.
Thanks, David.
No worries.
Great. We also have a question from David Nash.
Yes, my question's to David Simmonds as well, about tactile paving. The tactile pavers that we see at intersections and on the edges of platforms, TGSIs as they're called in the lingo. What are your opinions about those? I've heard some people with a visual disability say that they're overused, and wheelchair users complain about them because it's harder to wheel over them. Where do you think we sit with that? Do you think we've got the guidelines correct, or it needs some fine tuning?
Yeah, no, good question, David. My personal view on tactiles, TGSIs, particularly, well, I think hazard tactiles, which for those that don't know are the round ones, typically at the edge of roads, road crossings and platforms, absolutely critical. If someone is either blind or has low vision and they're using a mobility device, whether it be a cane or a guide dog, using those devices in an appropriate manner should avoid the person encountering those hazards anyway. But it's that extra bit of information that helps you from falling off the edge of a platform or wandering onto a road unknowingly. Yes, in terms of directional tactile, so the straight ones that would give that sort of more directional information as opposed to hazard information. There are a lot of environments where I would certainly say, as a user of those tactiles, people have over-tactiled an environment, and it then just becomes really confusing. So I think in terms of directional tactiles, less is more. But I think that one of the reasons that's become an issue is because the guidelines, the standards around the use of directional tactiles haven't provided the clarity required by those people delivering infrastructure where hazard tactiles or directional tactiles are required. So certainly through the modernisation process, I am certainly advocating for, I can't really say too much about what that task force is working on, but I can certainly tell you what I'm advocating for, and that is for greater clarity around the use of directional tactiles.
Great, thanks, David. We've also got a question from Laura Rudd. If Laura is here. Okay, no problem. So I think this is also a question to David about the program. Are you aware of any or working with any other states to implement the program in other states around, I'm assuming, Australia?
Yeah, I'm assuming Laura's probably asking about the Travelling in the Shoes of Others program. Yes, so through the department is a member of the Australasian Railway Association, and so through our membership of that organisation, and also through our work with the National Accessible Transport Task Force, we have great relationships established with our colleagues in different jurisdictions around the country. And they're certainly aware of our program, and yet again, another thing I'm advocating for with the modernisation of DSAP, the standards, is for there to be a greater level of education provided to staff within operators and and authorities, not just education to frontline staff, because in my mind, nearly everyone within, I'm sure there are exceptions, but nearly everyone within the Department of Transport or our operators, doesn't matter what role you have within those organisations, at some point in time, you're going to be making a decision that may impact on the accessibility of the network. So what I'm really pushing for in that space, in the modernisation of DSAP, is for there to be more education or requirements for educating staff across authorities and also operators.
Nice. So next we have Bridget Burdett. So a question for David as well.
Yeah, so following on, David, I'm not sure whether the program that you talk about is what some of my friends in the disability sector would call simulation training, or where it's actually that able people use a wheelchair or have some kind of simulation of different kinds of vision impairments. Because I know some of those people don't like that kind of training, not because it doesn't achieve the outcomes that you talked about, but it can result in people assuming that they then know what it's like to live with a vision impairment or to use a wheelchair for the rest of your life, whereas doing a walking in your shoes for a day or an hour is really not sufficient. So I wonder whether the value in those programs is to foster those relationships that you talk about, to break down the barriers of communication between professionals and community, rather than you know, transferring a true understanding, because I don't think any of us really can get that from a training program, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, good question, Bridget. Yes, I suspect it is a program that some groups would call a simulation activity, because that's essentially what it's doing. I facilitate majority of those sessions, and so what I think I bring to those sessions is a degree of authenticity. But I also emphasise through those sessions that this is going to give you a glimpse of what it might be like for a very short period of time. But I would encourage, and I have encouraged, those people who are sceptical about the benefits of this program to come along and participate in the program, because if you were engaged in the debrief after the session, or if a person with a disability came along and just was a fly on the wall in those debrief sessions, they would realise how powerful and what a change it makes to people who participate in the program. As I said earlier, it gives that real light bulb, it provides that real light bulb moment for them. But not to say that takes the place of any, and what my branch is really big on encouraging departments or teams within the department or delivery agencies to consult with people with disabilities when you're designing things at the really early stage. So that is one thing that we really emphasise through those training sessions, that it's really important, because compliance doesn't always equal good accessible outcomes. You can have something that's totally compliant with DSAP, for example, and it not deliver a good accessible outcome. So that's where it's really key to consult with people with specific accessibility requirements to make sure we can end up with that really good accessible outcome. But I take your point though, and I am aware that some people with disability might, view the program poorly. But I'm sure if they participated in the debrief, they would see what an amazing, and the feedback we get is incredible. It really makes a difference to people and their attitude.
Yeah, that's really good. I kind of see it as the first step on their journey of enlightenment. So that kind of breaks down that fear. Yeah, it's not a one-stop shop, done it, know it all now. It's starting their journey to be more inclusive professionals. Yeah,
it's really and it's really to because what's a really poor outcome is where a piece of infrastructure is delivered. People work on it, they think that they know the standards, they know what to do, they don't consult, and then we end up with a really poor outcome, poor accessible outcome. This is really trying to raise the awareness of the need to consider accessibility with everything we do. So that's just one part, it's a part of our strategy to really raise the awareness of accessibility throughout the department.
Great, thanks, David. We've got another question from Laura.
Yes, thanks, Kathy. Now, I noticed Bridget shared an example of social disadvantage index data that was available in New Zealand, and I'm familiar with such indices that anyone can download through the ABS or through Oren here in Australia, similar indices. And Janine shared a list of infrastructure projects that mention equity or providing remote access. I'm wondering if we see this data about equity factored into project appraisal. If the panelists or anyone in attendance, because I'm sure we have folks who work on such projects, know of any examples where equity is factored into project appraisal, I'd be really interested to know. And if not, why not?
I'll have a go at answering that. It's a really big question because projects cover a huge range of, you have little detail fixing an intersection or a crossing versus a policy on transport strategy for a region versus, programs and plans. I don't think any of those things adequately consider equity at the moment. And if they do, it's often not, as David said, done early enough for an infrastructure project or comprehensively enough in terms of involving the voice of people who are routinely disadvantaged. And why that happens, there's lots of reasons, but I think it's just really hard, and it's really outside of the engineering brief that a lot of these projects come from. It's out of scope, and it's therefore considered a tack on, if at all. So that's why I like showing people maps and graphs that are really easily available, because they talk to that language of transport engineering and planning, where data can be really powerful alongside some of the stories that Janine was talking about. I think if we use stats and stories, then that's the way to start getting more action in that area.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'd also like to add to that the Department of Transport here in Victoria has done amazing things in terms of informing things such as their business case investment lifecycle guidance form with things that touch on user-centered design and the process that the department expects these the project groups to respond to. So I think that perhaps an education campaign needs to take place in terms of the stuff that's buried in legislation, such as the Transport Integration Act, etc. They all touch on it, and we just have to champion it consistently and deliberately in all of our briefs. To be quite honest, the more that we just keep banging on this and saying, you know, you've got to talk to these people, you've got to get these insights, you've got to get these perspectives, because they'll actually help you create designs that are the top of that design hierarchy. They're creative, they're going to be innovative, and they're going to be so equitable. So I hand on heart truly believe that we're getting started. We just need to translate, as Bridget was saying, things into the language that net transport engineers can also understand as well.
Great, thanks Bridget and Janine. So I think if David Wanty is on the call, if you want to, I think you've also added a comment.
Yeah, question for David. I heard at the ITE forum recently, the virtual one, that wheelchair users were getting stuck in the round domes of tactile pavers, and that the blind were really relying on sound to identify places to cross the road and not reliant on other means of detecting these pavers. So do you care to comment on wheelchair users really getting stuck between the domes? Should they, the design of them be changed? These are what I think you called the hazard ones.
Yeah, the hazard tactiles. I've not heard of or heard any reports of anyone getting stuck on hazard tactiles. I am aware of wheelchair users or users of motorised mobility devices not being particular fans of tactiles, particularly in environments such as a train station platform, where there's limited space for limited circulation space, and so there's typically in access pathways you've got directionals or hazards, which people using wheelchairs and motorised mobility devices find, I think, from time to time impact on their how they manoeuvre and can, you know, change the grip on of their device. I haven't heard of any devices getting stuck between the domes of the hazard tactiles, so I'm not sure, and I've not heard any discussion about hazard tactiles being redesigned in any way. That being said, I mean, there are a number of suppliers and manufacturers of hazard tactiles, so there's many different types from, you know, made of various different materials and slightly different shapes in terms of the actual dome themselves. But no, never heard of anyone getting stuck.
Perhaps I could add to that. I support what David Simmonds has said. Dave Wanty, I have heard of people getting stuck who use wheelchairs and tactiles. Maybe New Zealand ones are slightly different, I'm not sure. But my conclusion, having talked to a lot of people who are blind or low vision and a lot of people who use wheelchairs, is that the worst case scenario is that absence of tactiles can stop someone who is blind from crossing the road or making a trip, versus they make a journey a little bit more difficult or annoying for someone who uses a wheelchair. So I have this kind of trade-off in my head. Yeah, is this making the trip harder or is it making the trip impossible? And so you have a kind of a hierarchy of need in that case. And from that perspective, I think, as David says, certainly warning tactiles, hazard tactiles, there is no real reason not to use them because they enable participation for people. Without them there, they can't make a trip safely. So, yep, they can be annoying, and I know that. They can be slippery. They can be slippery for kids on manual scooters as well. But that doesn't stop those people making the trip.
Okay, thanks for that.
So I think we have finished most of the questions in the chat. Let me know if I haven't gotten to your question. But I might just put in my own question for the three speakers then. What does the future of inclusive and equitable transport look like to you? I know we've sort of touched on it in the presentations, but maybe as a final question, maybe Janine want to get started?
Oh, the future. Perhaps we're going to start seeing more and more of these variables that you can test your solution against to really zone in on the most valuable solutions. So we talk a lot about, desirability, feasibility, viability, etc. We want to zone in on the most valuable solution that kind of balances all of those. And I think that the richness of the insights and the quality of the insights that you get actually from all of these representative groups actually just pushes you further to get greater design. So I think the more that we can do it, the better our results will be, really. So the sooner we start, the greater it'll be.
Great, thanks, Janine. David, Bridget, if you've got anything else.
Ladies first.
Thanks. Yeah, so what Janine's talking about is improving our inputs, so better engagement, better tools, better ways of knowing that what we're designing is going to give a good outcome. And I agree that all of that is necessary, but in my optimistic future, we're also measuring an outcome. Because otherwise it's like doing road safety by saying, oh, this design's safe and that design's safe, but we don't even know whether the crashes are coming down. So I think we need to start going out there and counting and doing more surveys and understanding the experiences of a whole range of different groups and how they use transport, what trips they make and don't make, and how that results in revealed diversity of participation. Are we seeing 1% of the population who uses a wheelchair out in the streets and using it? If not, why not? And using that data to drive the feedback loop so that inclusiveness is not just something that we try to do and then hope that it works, but we measure and we know that it works.
For me, I'd like to think in terms of in the future. I'd like to think that my branch won't exist. The future for me is where accessibility and universal design is baked in. It's something that's embedded in everything we do, and there isn't a need for a branch like mine to advocate for better, more accessible and inclusive outcomes across the transport sector. So that's what it looks like for me. But that being said, I think I'm going to be in a job for quite a bit longer to go yet. And so the future for me is as a department, we're doing the amount of infrastructure work that's going on across Victoria at the moment in the transport sector is incredible. So I see that exciting and expansive work to continue, that we learn from our experiences and we get better and better at delivering more accessible, inclusive and universal designs and pieces of infrastructure and conveyances. And until we get to, and I'd like to think that we're poised to be and positioned to be a state and the real jewel in the crown of Australia in terms of somewhere to go where there is really good, accessible and universally designed infrastructure and conveyances. We can really tap into there's a really big market out there for accessible tourism. Obviously not at the moment with the current pandemic, but obviously borders and the like will reopen. And I'd like to think that we are really seen worldwide as leaders in accessible public transport.
Great, thanks David, Bridget and Janine. So I'm going to wrap up the webinar now. Firstly, thank you again to our speakers for presenting today. We really appreciate your effort and your expertise in this field. If you've got any questions after the webinar, feel free to reach out to myself or the presenters. I would also like to again mention that we do have an evaluation form. I'm going to just make Laura a presenter so she can share her screen. I think there's also a link in the chat box. But we would really appreciate your quick feedback to help inform and improve our future webinars and fireside chats. From here, this concludes our webinar. So thank you for attending, and we hope you enjoyed this session.